Hello, I'm Kads, and welcome back to the Raid Starter Pack. Now, traditionally in this series, I focused it more on the early game and the mid game, talking about the core dungeons and Doom Tower, all of the Doom Tower bosses, but this time we're jumping more so to the end game. We're going to talk about Amius, the Lunar Archon, the boss of Cursed City, aka Sintranos. This is meant to be a fairly comprehensive guide, so we are going to be breaking down all of his abilities, his passive, his weaknesses, and talk about the teams, or the structure of teams that will work against him. And then I'll try and showcase you my team for this rotation, just to give you an example and talk about some of the more nuanced aspects of this fight. And so with that, let's jump right into his abilities. Now, the first thing you may notice or may know about Amius is that, of course, he is a mythical champion, meaning he does have two forms. He will metamorph between them, and his abilities, mostly asterisk, follow a relatively predictable form or a sequence. And I say mostly because he's an extremely finicky boss if you don't exactly know what you're doing, but once you get him into the proper cycle, it's pretty straightforward and predictable. But every once in a while, even if you do, he can kind of go a little bit haywire. But we'll talk about the typical triggers for him to go a little bit haywire. So let's start off with his base form, Form 1, with the A3. So Rampant Chaos, it will remove any block buffs from himself, and it will replace block buffs, and basically anything that's negative, he will flip it to positive. You can kind of read the text there, and all of the reflected or mirrored buffs will last for 3 turns. So this is generally speaking very bad, meaning, decreased attack will be flipped by increased attack, heal reduction will be flipped to continuous heals, etc. So it can be very, very bad. And then to boot, he also will place a stun debuff on all enemies. Now this can be resisted, so that is an option, but the stat requirements are relatively high, especially for hard mode. And then if you're a mythical champion, then it will force you to change form, which can be very annoying. So I do not recommend, I'll mention this at the beginning, but I don't recommend that you run mythicals in this fight, just because it's a lot harder to predict, or a lot harder to make them work, because he's going to constantly force them to change forms, as you'll see throughout a handful of his abilities. The last thing here is that it will fill his turn meter by 10% for each debuff converted into a buff. So generally speaking, you don't want to stack him up with a bunch of debuffs so that he can use his ability and flip them, but you do want to try and dodge the stun in a simple block debuffs, cleanser, or high resistance will allow you to bypass that. Now, the main caveat with this particular skill is that he will prioritize this if and when he has certain types of debuffs, or he has the flippable debuffs on him. So if you start the fight by placing decreased attack, he will more likely than not go for Rampant Chaos as A3 instead of going for the A2, which may or may not be desired depending upon your team composition, but just keep that in mind. And the same thing, we'll come back to it a little bit, but when he's flipping from Form 2 back into Form 1, the same rule applies. So if you have some sort of debuff that is flippable on him, he will instead go for this ability, which could be bad because he might flip your heal reduction into a continuous heal and then go into the A2, which we'll talk about, which could be very bad and kind of basically reset your progress. The A2 is the big money ability that you probably all heard about, and the reason why you want heal reduction in general in this fight. It's an AoE attack. Before attacking, he increases the duration of all buffs on himself and decreases the duration of all debuffs on him, and then he will heal himself by 20% of his max HP, which of course, being a boss, is a massive heal. And then it will also increase by 5% for each buff that has its duration increased. So essentially, if you don't have heal reduction on him, this is a massive heal, and it will basically restart the fight from wherever you were if he uses it even one time. You can get around this heal, of course, with heal reduction. You can also get around it by Brimstone can kind of counteract some of the damage, and also you can just out DPS if that is possible, depending upon your team comp and the strength of your builds and your champions. Similar to the A3, this will also fill his turn meter by 10% for each debuff, in this case, that has its duration decreased. So the main caveat here with his A2 is that he will typically prioritize this if he thinks he has an opportunity to kill someone. But if everyone's super tanky on your team, they're all under shields and strengthens and whatnot, he's definitely gonna, when he changes forms back from Form 2 into Form 1, he's definitely gonna prioritize Rampant Chaos, the A3, which may or may not be what you want him to do. And also this will apply at the beginning of the fight. Of course, he starts in Form 1, so depending upon the strength or perceived strength of your team, he might go for the heal or go for the A3, kind of depends on that. So you can manipulate it depending on your team comp, how tanky they are, how squishy they are, what buffs you start off with, etc. However, as we'll get into, it's not very, very important that you kind of start the ball rolling right at the gate. He'll settle into the desired rotation once you kind of get things going. Lastly, on the base form, we have the A1 here, which is kind of the most nonchalant ability he has in his kit, but it's an AoE attack, increases the damage inflicted by 10% for each buff on him, so he'll just hit harder if you let him buff, but ideally you don't let that happen based on what you've done to manage the other abilities. And then he will heal himself by 100% of damage dealt which is minimal because, unless he's like killing your entire team, but even then his health pool is millions and your health pool is thousands or tens of thousands, so it's not good. That heal is basically negligible. Moving on to the passives for Form 1, whenever you heal, he can heal by 25% of that value, and you can basically ignore this because, again, relative to his overall health pool, you healing your champions by 10,000 is not going to mean that much when he has millions of HP. We also saw this a bit earlier from his A1, but he will heal himself if he hits into a shield and stuff like that, but again, negligible for the exact same reasons. And this one is very, very, very important. Whenever an enemy decreases a skill cooldown with an artifact, accessory, mastery, or skill, it will also decrease the cooldown of essentially his metamorph ability. So you do not want reflex, merciless, refresh accessories, all that type of stuff. You do not want that in this fight. You can survive with them, but you're going to be making him go way out of sequence, and you might not have your abilities off a cooldown. Cycle of Magic, the mastery will do the same thing as well. So you can run them, but again, it's just very dangerous. So highly recommended to not have that on the champions you're going to be using for this fight. On the second passive, he will place an Eclipse buff on himself with this. Essentially is what he does when he's in Form 2. And then the passive effect here is that it will revive him with 30% health and 50% turn meter if he's killed with that buff, meaning if he's killed when he's in Form 2. So when you do kill him, if you don't want to be stuck in an infinite loop, just like we talked about before with his healing and whatnot and other things, you make sure you have to kill him in Form 1, or if you have the chance to, you can try and block revive when he's in Form 2 if you kill him that way. That can also work. In terms of things to note from the other standard boss passives, his enemy max HP restriction is capped at 5%. 10% is the norm for all other types of bosses, but in this case 5% is the thing. And then this awakening level stuff will matter when we get to Form 2, but you will deal more damage and take less damage depending on your level of awakening. Switching over to his second form, let's talk about these abilities, and this is definitely where the fight can go a little bit haywire depending upon how you've set things up and the structure of your team or the composition of your team and where your abilities are. So with this ability, he will do the opposite of mirroring. So he will flip all of your positive buffs into negative debuffs, meaning that you do not want to swap forms if you have increased defense and strengthen, because then you'll have decreased defense and weaken. That will make you take a lot of damage. You may or may not want to have continuous heals out there because we'll flip those into heal reduction. Therefore you can't heal, etc. So it can be very, very bad. But at the same time, in order to force him to use this ability, you do want him to have some sort of buff out there so that he will go for this one. Otherwise he will go to his other abilities, which could be deadly, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So ideally, like, increased attack is a great one because you don't really care about raw damage, so to speak, and he can flip it to decreased attack, and it's not really going to do that much negative relative to your team. So again, we'll see that once we go into the fight itself. He will also place a sleep debuff on all enemies, and this cannot be blocked or resisted. So that's, you can't block it. Even if you have block debuffs, it wouldn't matter. He would flip that into block buffs anyways, stuff like that. But yeah, this is another case where he will force your mythicals to change form. So again, I'll reiterate, you can run mythicals if you happen to have one, but it will be very, very annoying because he will be constantly switching forms, and he will also be constantly forcing you to switch form, which may or may not be ideal depending upon the mythical that you may or may not have. And then lastly, it will fill his turn meter by 10% for each buff converted into a debuff. So again, you don't want to have too many buffs out there for him to flip, otherwise he's going to get a lot of turn meter, but it won't matter all that much because of course you're going to be asleep for most of this turn. So he will basically get another turn because you're going to be CC'd here, and then he'll go into the A2 here, which is an AoE attack. Before attacking, he'll increase the duration of all debuffs and decrease the duration of all buffs on all enemies. So again, he's attacking you, and then he'll increase damage by 5% of the target's max HP for each enemy buff that has its duration decreased. So typically you're not going to have that many buffs at that point based on him leading off with the ability, but nonetheless it's worth it to understand that. And then he'll decrease your turn meter. So typically he will flip all of your buffs, like again in the standard cycle, he will flip all of your positive buffs into negative buffs. He'll get a lot of turn meter, you're going to be asleep, and then he'll go right into this ability here, which will wake you up. So you don't necessarily have to worry about the sleep making you lose a turn, depending upon how many buffs you use to bait out the ability. The very scary part though is his A1, which can be and is very, very deadly. It will attack one enemy 2 times and will ignore 100% of the target's defense. He does a lot of damage. He packs a big punch with this ability, and he can easily start snowballing from here and just killing everyone on your team one by one for a couple of reasons. One, he ignores all of your defense, and two, if he kills an enemy, it will instantly activate the Maniacal Bedlam, which is his A3. So he will once again try to flip all your buffs into buffs, and buffs into debuffs, and then he will also put you to sleep, which will cause you to miss your turn potentially, and then he can come back in, kill someone else with the A1, and you just die one by one on that in sequence. The good news is you do have some flexibility as to who he will target with this ability. He will typically go for, the squishiest champion, or the highest defense champion, depending on things. It could be either one. If he thinks he can kill someone, like you have a really squishy nuker on your team, he's probably going to go for them. But he will also try to go for the person with the highest defense, because of course, if they have high defense, relatively low HP, he ignores all their defense, therefore he can easily kill them. But you can mitigate this by having some awakening on your target champion. So ideally, you'd be like 4-star plus, but essentially you can reduce the ignore defense effect all the way up to 50%, meaning that it will only ignore 50% of your defense, meaning it's not going to, do pure damage, and thus it can be a lot more survivable. And you can also manipulate who this will target. If you happen to have a perfect veil or veil champion, he will target, of course, who is not under the veil. Moving on to his passive here, it will reduce the amount of healing you can do in the ult form by 50%, which again is kind of irrelevant. Your healing will be reduced, but you have such low HP relative to him that it's still going to be enough healing in general for you to use your abilities freely, so you don't have to worry about that necessarily. And he will also ignore shield block damage and unkillables. And then the most important thing, one of the most important things in this form too, once again reiterating, you do not want reflex, merciless, refresh accessories, cycle of magic, because anything that reduces a cooldown, it will trigger his A1 on a random enemy, which again, he can start cycling. This will trigger, if this kills somebody, this will trigger the A3, puts everyone to sleep, and you can just, again, he can snowball in there, start taking out your team one by one. Very, very unexciting, or not exciting when that does happen. Interestingly enough, when he's in form 2, the enemy max HP cap is at 10%, so it's only 5% on the base form, but again, that's the form you typically want to kill him in. And then the same thing applies here, where you take less damage for having awakening and you deal more damage for having awakening. So that was a lot of information, and I'll try to break it down a little bit more as we get into the fight, as we do the demo. But in terms of the team composition, how I typically structure my teams, and we're not going to show some one-shot craziness going on here, right? This is a pretty standard comp. You want some sort of champion who's your designated hero reduction champion. In this case, it's fairly easy. We have a Morrigan, but if you just use the filter here, you can see whoever you might have on your account who has hero reduction, and you do want to build them again with relatively high accuracy. We'll talk about those requirements a little bit later. Actually, we could just look at Morrigan because she's basically right there. But for hard mode, it's somewhere around, I want to say like 475, so 500-ish is kind of your target. For normal mode, I think it's around 350-ish accuracy is what you're going to need, but that's just to keep those values in mind. But yeah, you filter on hero reduction, look for that. That's typically the most important thing, just because again, that kind of prevents you from having to deal with them healing on form 1. I typically like to run double reviver. It's not necessarily, it's not always necessary, but that can be helpful to keep your team alive and running. Or you can run one reviver, ideally an AoE reviver, and someone who's like your primary healing champion. Wither the Crown is a great one. Rector Drath, Ugo, champions like that who have a pretty massive heal in their abilities. But in this case, we're going to run double reviver. Arbiter is absolutely fantastic for this because she does a couple of jobs. She has the increased attack, which is good for the buff bait that we talked about. And then it's also an AoE revive as opposed to Siphi in this case, which has a single target revive, which is still useful just in case Arbiter is on cooldown. But ideally, you want to pick everyone back up so that they're in sync with their abilities at the same time. And then after that, you can run DPSs. Obviously, if you have some overlap, you can kind of mix and match. You can have triple DPS if you have your healer reviver that's also your hero reduction champion, etc., stuff like that. But in this case, we're going to be running Rhodos because Rhodos is fun to use with Siphi, but that's he's more of a raw damage dealer. But in this case, I like Rhodos because once you stack up enough enemy stolen HP, you can block revive. So if you do happen to kill him in form 2, Rhodos uses the A3 to finish him off. You don't have to worry about him reviving himself. And then Nishak's in there because he's going against a boss, so his bombs are going to do a lot more damage. We also get a lot of poisons out there. They're protected poisons, meaning that they cannot be reduced or reduced by a lot of the skills that he has in his skill set that can reduce the duration of debuffs that are on him, and that's nice. And he also, of course, has decreased attack, which is definitely useful in this fight. However, it is not mandatory to have decreased attack, depending upon your team composition. But in this case, we'll see it used a couple of times here and there. All right, so let's go ahead and hop into a battle here so I can talk talk you through the fight as well as a lot of the nuances that come with the fight. And the first thing to mention out of the gate is when you have champions with a debuff on their A1, like Arbiter, for example, if you have enough accuracy to land it, it can force him into the wrong rotation. So again, you have to be wary about that. Ideally, once again, you do start him off with the A2 as well at the start of the fight, as well as when he's changing from Form 2 back into Form 1, as we'll see here. And again, because we have it set up such that we have relatively squishy champions on our team, that being Rotos, relatively low HP, and Nishak, relatively low HP compared to the supports on the squad, he should indeed go for the A2 because in his mind, he thinks he has a chance of killing one of them. So we are not going to use Arbiter's A1. We're going to start with the increased attack just so we avoid placing the weaken. She doesn't have enough accuracy to land it, but every once in a while, 3%, you can have a chance to proc that, and that could be detrimental and force him into the wrong rotation. Morgaine is, of course, a kind of a cheat code when it comes to Amius because her heal reduction is whenever she takes a turn, and it is protected, meaning it cannot be blocked or have the duration decreased. So she definitely helps. But I'll also talk about when in the fight typically you would use a normal heal reduction champion as well. Let's carry on here. We're just going to use her A1. She doesn't really need to do anything. For Nishak, we are going to place the bombs, but for everything we just talked about earlier, I don't want him to start with the A3, so we're not going to place decreased attack. We're just going to A1, try to place more bombs, and Rotos is Rotos, so we're just going to do a little bit of damage. So he should be able to take his turn here, and and thus we have successfully baited out that ability there. Unfortunately, he did do a lot of damage to Nishak, but that is to be expected because he is relatively squishy, so that's not really that surprising. So we can tank that. We can put out some more bombs. We are once again going to use the A1 here. We don't want him to flip decreased attack into increased attack, and that's why we're protecting our team from future damage by not letting him do that. Ideally, Arbiter does not place weaken. Unlucky there, but she did. She doesn't have enough accuracy for this fight. I think she has like 350, so we got unlucky. But every once in a while she can land it, but it's not the end of the world. So now we're going to put up block debuffs right here, and then we'll use the Nishak's A1 once again. But the key here is that we're trying to block the stun that he's going to use here. So he will flip the weaken into a strengthen, as we'll see. He'll take a lot of damage from the bombs, of course. Those will turn into poisons. He has the strengthen now because of the weaken that was from Arbiter. And now we can carry on with the fight. We can do a little bit more damage with the Rotos. We can now, at this point, I'm fine to place decreased attack because we are switching from Form 2 into Form 1 after one turn. So that is why it's safe to do that because he'll just do a little bit less damage when he switches forms, and also it extends the duration of the poisons. And in this case, we do have a lot of buffs out there, which can be a little bit dangerous. It looks like he is a little bit out of sequence, actually. So, because of course, Rotos is in a Merciless set. So having him in Merciless in this team is fine just because we have a passive that places the heal reduction. But if you're using a team centered around a champion who has it on an active, you do want to preserve his turn count. And so we'll try to keep an eye on that as we go through this particular fight. And so we're going to A1 there. We reset heal reduction, the duration of that. We have this, and then everything's protected. But it doesn't really matter for Rotos. Again, with Siphi is kind of powerful, but we have block debuffs protected on him. He will cleanse himself because he's Rotos, but that obviously won't apply to most other DPSs. They're going to be slept. We're going to miss a turn here. We get lapped a little bit, and then he's going to try and kill Rotos because he's a little bit on the squishier side. Or actually, sorry, I think he got a Merciless proc there once again, so he took an A1, but he's 6-star awakened on my account, so you can see he barely took any damage. So here, we do want to just kind of A1 cycle. There's not much to do. He's going to use the big AoE. It's not going to do a lot of damage because we had decreased attack out there. We have heal reduction placed again. And now typically, like I mentioned in going over his skills, this is the point at which you would want to place heal reduction manually on him when you have that champion. It could be a Venom Mage. I think in this rotation, like Archbishop Pinthroy, Mashal, Lorne the Cutter, all those types of champions. After he does the double turn on Form 2, so he puts everyone to sleep, and then he follows it up with the A2. Then when you have a few turns before he switches back is when you want to place the heal reduction. So this would be that moment. So we're going to continue on here with the A1s. I don't even know if there's any room for debuffs, but nonetheless, no, it's just A1. Yeah, there's one spot for debuffs. So we're going to do that. We're going to do A1 here. We're going to do A1 here. We're going to do A1 here. We're basically just kind of stalling. There's not a whole lot to do. And he should go for Nishak. He is the squishiest on the team. He's also the champion with the least amount of awakening stars, and that is expected. So if Nishak was 6-star awakened, he would take less damage, and also if he had a lot higher defense, because we'd be reducing the amount of defense that he ignores. So just keep those things in mind. If you want your target to survive, you're going to have them have relatively high defense, relatively low HP, and then they'll be good to go. So at this point now, when there's one turn left on the A3, he's not going to use it again. He's going to metamorph back into his basic form. And based on the health pool here of Nishak being, he's half HP, we're kind of setting him up to die. But the key here is that we're forcing Amius, when he changes back into form 1, that he is indeed going to use the A2 to try and heal and not try to flip heal reduction. Again, if you were using a champion who has it not protected, you don't want him to flip that and continuous heals right at the start, and that's kind of reset all of your progress. So at this point we are free to buff, so we are going to put increased speed out there. I don't want to waste block buffs or block debuffs, because we want to save that for when he goes for the stun. And then here we can place more bombs, and then once again place more bombs, still keeping in mind that we don't want to place decreased attack. So he's going to try and kill Nishak there. He almost killed Morrigan as well, but that is per the plan. That's exactly what we wanted him to do. So now he tried to heal. He has heal reduction, so nothing happened. We can continue dealing damage with Rhodos. Now again, in this case I'll try and use Arbiter's A2 just to make sure that she doesn't happen to accidentally place the weaken. So now we put up block debuffs because we know he's going to stun. And then we can place more bombs with the A1 of Nishak. There we go. Let's go ahead and heal them up. The good thing about the A3 is that, as you may have noticed already, is that it's not an attack. So you can definitely try and make sure that you heal up in between when he uses the A2 and when he uses the A3. So hopefully she doesn't place weaken. Resisted. Perfect. There we go. She did what she's supposed to do that time. She being Arbiter. But unlucky 3% resist there. But yep, Arbiter's a little bit too fast, I guess. So she outran the block debuffs, but everyone else is good to go. You'll see there, we got the decreased cooldown on Rhodos, which means once again that we're getting one turn sooner on his rotation back to form 2, which is bad. But I think we can make it work in this particular instance. But again, typically, you don't want champions with merciless reflex, etc. in this team. But the one exception is because we have Morrigan on this squad. Therefore, I can get away with it because we have permanent hit reduction in this version. So now once again, because he's going to flip into form 2, we can place more bombs, and I think we might have filled the bar, but we would be fine regardless to place the decreased attack. And in this case, we can try and kill him. Ooh, close. I think he might die before he switches forms, therefore it counts, and so he's not going to get revived. And there you have it. There is the fight, the example fight for Amius. So again, this is kind of a somewhat of an endgame luxury example. You're probably not going to have the Siphi and the Rhodos. You may or may not have Morrigan, but the key here is that Arbiter is definitely accessible. Nishak is a proxy for any DPS, ideally someone who has soft damage, so to speak. In this case, soft damage being the bombs and the poisons, but HP burn can work. And in fact, let me look at the champion selection here to talk about other champions who could work in these 2 slots. All right, so backing out here, let's talk about champions you might have a higher chance of having access to. So a good champion who's kind of like pure damage would be a Wukong. Obviously, he's a very good tank for Form 2 because he will revive himself, so you don't have to worry about that. And he's regularly going to be the target because he is relatively squishy. Obviously, a lot of people aren't going to have a Siphi, but if you do want some form, any form of block debuffs like Tutor Rhymehide can work. Hacker and Smash Lord can work. Anyone who places block debuffs can work in that role. Siphi is just more beneficial because she has a revive as well. Lady Noelle, if you don't want to use Arbiter, if you have a high resistance Lady Noelle, she can also be a good AoE reviving option. Obviously, the freeze won't land. Brimstone is definitely your friend, so if you happen to have a 5-star soul on someone who has enough accuracy to land it, that could be a good source of damage. Again, that would replace the Rhodos Nishak combo I'm using here. It could be someone who has that. Stock the Broken is good for poisons. He's the fusion you may have had access to. Obviously, epics aren't going to have Brimstone, but anyone again who puts out a burn is good. It's just soft damage. Urgrim is great for this. The poisons, the healing, good support, stuff like that. So you can definitely make it work and mix and match people. But let's say, for example, we want to keep Arbiter in there. Let's run Lady Noelle in the mix as well. We want a heat reduction champion. So let's say that we're running Lauren the Cutter in that slot. And then what was the last thing we needed? We have 2 revivers. We have a DPS. We have a heal reduction champion, and then honestly the last slot could be anyone. It could be a support, it could be again someone like Stock the Broken with poisons, or let's just if we're trying to keep it epics, it could definitely be let's say Urgrim, for example. So this could be a more budget friendly team that can definitely work. But yeah, one thing to keep in mind again is that if you have a champion who places heal reduction alongside something else, that might influence the rotation of the boss. So a great example of this, or a good example of what you want, or something that's an acceptable combination, is a debuff that cannot be flipped, meaning Leech is a good one in this case for Lorne the Cutter. However, a bad example would actually be Old Gruckus, because I've tested him in the past and he has the unfortunate unique combination of heal reduction and decreased attack. So because you're putting decreased attack out there, when he flips back from form 2 into form 1, he will invert these debuffs into buffs, meaning that he will effectively cleanse himself, he will give himself continuous heals, and he'll have increased attack, which means it'll be very, very easy for him to kill you right afterward. So Old Gruckus is definitely not recommended as your heal reduction champion, so just keep that in mind. But Lorne the Cutter is a great option. Mashald can work, and obviously Morrigan is best in class. All right, so now I'm going to highlight the builds on these champions, and I will note that 4 out of 5 of them are built entirely for different purposes, so they're not really built in this way specifically for Amius. I'm just keeping their builds as they are for the arena in this case. But Morrigan is one of the champions who is built specifically for the fight, and so we'll go over her first just to kind of highlight how you would want to build your support champion or your heal reduction champion. You don't necessarily want them to be a squishy nuker like Lorne the Cutter. In terms of building them for damage, you want to build them to survive so that he can stay alive and place the heal reduction as needed. So my Morrigan here, a little talking through her build. She is in a double speed set with perception, so I wanted her on the faster side, but again, we want enough accuracy to be able to land and maintain that heal reduction up against the boss. So in terms of the total stats, 51,000 on the HP, 3,200 on the defense, 300 on the speed, 528 on the accuracy. Again, 475 plus is where you want to be on the accuracy. 300 speed, definitely overkill. You don't necessarily need her to be that fast. I believe Amius himself is around 270, if I'm not mistaken. So you do want to be faster than him, but you don't need to be 30 speed faster than him. There is no relic on her. We don't have to worry about that. She is booked. However, of course, the passive you don't necessarily need to book. And honestly, as you saw, we never really used her A2. You don't really need decreased accuracy. It's not going to do a ton for you. In most cases, a lot of what he does can't be resisted anyways. The increased speed can be nice, but again, you don't really necessarily need to book it. And then he's immune to decreased speed, so that doesn't really matter. So you could run her unbooked if you wanted to run her in this just for taking turns with the passive. Now, I did used to use her a long time ago in the arena, so she is kind of built in terms of masteries for that. So the support tree on the right hand side, we're picking up a lot of the standard debuffer stuff, all the accuracy boosting stuff, turn meter boosting stuff, ending on Eagle Eye for the extra bit of accuracy, and then continuing on with the arena theme where we have a little bit of the defense tree. But yeah, she's been decommissioned from arena and recommissioned specifically for the Amius fight. Next up, we have my Nishak Verminlord, who is optimized for arena, as you might expect. He's one of my primary arena bomber. So he's in a 4-piece feral set with 2 pieces of perception. So basically triple perception, but for now he does have block debuffs, which is kind of nice going into like Torments and Hegemons and stuff like that. So total stats on him: 50,000 on the HP, 6.8k on the attack. Of course, his attacks matches or scales, his bomb damage scales with attack. 274 on the speed, just a little bit faster than Amius, and then overkill on the accuracy relative to the Amius, but this is high because again, this is an arena champion on my account. So 724 on the accuracy. I do have a relic on him. I have the Arachne Elixir, really good for him because, of course, as we saw, his bombs turn into poisons and the poisons would deal more damage. Relative to PvE content, that increase in poison damage is kind of negligible, but relative to PvP, it is absolutely substantial, as I'm sure many of you know by now. And in terms of skills, of course, he is booked. I do have a blessing on him. Lethal Dose. Morrigan notably does not have an awakening. It would help her be a little bit tankier, but it doesn't really matter for the sake of the fight. And I guess the one thing to point out there is that even though she has a lower level of awakening, because Nishak is so much squishier than her, that's why he was the target for form 2 of Amius. And again, if we had higher awakening, we would reduce the amount of defense he is ignoring. And then in terms of the masteries, arena focus here, or bomb arena focus, I should say. Support tree coming down, the same thing as Morrigan, basically, where we're focusing on Eagle Eye, the mastery for extra accuracy. And then we're coming down the offense tree, mainly just to get a little bit of attack. The rest of it is kind of irrelevant. I didn't even bother to finish it. So really just indexing more into accuracy. Next up, we have my Arena Arbiter. This is her normal build. This is her triple speed set, the fastest champion on my account. She's not in anything special for Amius. Is just as she, however you have built her, she will definitely work. So in terms of her total stats, 89,000 on the HP, 3,200 on the defense, 403 on the speed. Recently acquired as far as me having a champion over 400 speed, and then accuracy resistance somewhere in the 300s. But again, she does not have enough accuracy in this build to land the weaken on her A1. But every once in a while, 3% of the time, she'll land it anyways, just because of how that formula works. We don't have, or I do have a weak version, or a really low level journal of Necrotus on her, which definitely is a good relic to have on her. But yeah, you can see it's not that highly prioritized. She's booked, of course. Intimidating presence, 4-star. I got lucky with her soul, but that is, of course, for the arena. It doesn't really help us in this particular fight. I mean, I guess it did help, like the speed aura on Morrigan a tiny bit, but it's kind of irrelevant. And then for the masteries, again, arena minded here with the support tree and the defense tree. Support tree, we're kind of getting some of the turn meter, the stat boosting, Lower Steel, reviver type stuff, so spirit haste as well as lasting gifts. And then I went with timely intervention on her. That way she can get some turn meter when people are dead, that were or low HP. That way she can potentially cut in and revive them. And the defense tree, this is kind of the anti-Siffy route that I like to talk about. So we start off on the resistance side, we come down to Wisdom of Battle, so that if Siffy sleeps us, there's a 30% chance that we get block debuffs when we get our turn next. Therefore she can't just keep you in a perpetual state of sleeping. And then on the other side, we want Resurgent, of course, to remove debuffs. We want Cycle of Revenge for turn meter, and then Delay Death to take less damage. Next up, we have my other speed champion, my Siffy the Lost Bride, who's in 8 pieces of protection, still hoping out for that 9th piece. But yeah. She is, in terms of total stats, 97,000 on the HP, 3,800 on the defense, 373 on the speed, 646 on the accuracy. So she's definitely indexing into speed and accuracy. And again, this is another example of an arena build. And so she's just being used as she was, or as she is built for the arena. This is my higher level Journal of Necrotus on her. So at level 9, but still same logic there. It works the same as Arbiter, boosts the healing and turn meter fill. And then same thing on the Blessing, Intimidating Presence. It's a little bit stronger than Arbiter's. It's 5-star, but same logic there. And then for the masteries, somewhat similar to Arbiter, but a little bit different because it's more fleshed out towards the defense tree. But support tree, we're trying to get her as much HP as possible, of course. A little bit of extra healing. We want the turn meter fill, Lore of Steel. Same thing here for the reviver, lasting gifts for her buffs, obviously. And then for the defense tree, I wanted her to be a little bit tankier. Obviously, we don't really have to go the anti-Siffy route because she is a Siffy with the context of live arena and not going to run into a Siffy, at least in gold tiers. And so I went with Shadow Heal instead. But we do want to take less damage from crits a little bit. Same Solidarity, good for the resistance when you put out her buffs. Delay Death for the same thing. Retribution for the counterattacks, that can be clutch. And then, of course, extra resistance to have high resistance. And then lastly, we have my Arena Rhodos, who is in a 6-piece Merciless set and 2 pieces of Cruel. So this was the reason the 4-piece set effect is why we're reducing the cooldown of his Metamorph ability when he's in Form 1. So again, ideally you would avoid that, especially if you're running a traditional 3-turn cooldown here reduction placing champion. But because we're running Morrigan in the squad, that's why I was able to get away with having a Merciless set, despite saying you probably shouldn't do it. So in terms of total stats on my Rhodos, 45,000 on the HP, almost 7k on the attack, 3,300 on the defense, 270 on the speed, full crit rate, 327 on the crit damage, and then we don't care about his accuracy or his resistance. Obviously, this is a relatively well-built Rhodos, and I am in the end game. He is 6-star awakened and stuff like that. So just keep that in mind. That might not be achievable depending upon where you are in your progression if you happen to have him. For the relic, I am running the Hatter's Reserve, and so he just takes a little bit less damage for people who have attack lower than him. And once he starts stacking up HP, he can inflict more damage to enemies HP who's lower than his. In terms of the skills, of course, he's booked. Ward of the Fallen is the Blessing. And then for the masteries, as you might guess, it's more of an arena nuker for once in terms of the offense and the defense tree. So we're coming down to get the crit rate, crit damage, etc. Ruthless Ambush for the extra kind of instant damage, although you could argue in the current meta, extra speed is probably the way to go, so Whirlwind of Death might be a bit better. Cycle of Violence is great, especially when paired with the Merciless set, because you can double reduce the cooldown of his abilities, and he cycles through his really quickly, so you can potentially have back-to-back A3s, which can be absolutely devastating relative to your opponents. And then, you know, a lot of the extra damage stuff on the left-hand side, ultimately, of course, ending on Helm Smasher to ignore as much defense as possible. Defense tree, pretty simple Z shape here, coming down through the resistance, improved parry through delayed death, and then coming or ending on retribution for the counterattack. All right, so that is going to do it for the Raid Starter Pack episode talking about Amius, the Lunar Archon, the first ever mythical boss in the game. So hopefully you do have a better understanding of his skill kit, and more importantly, his skill rotation, and understand more so how to force him into the proper skill rotation, as we kind of highlighted there. I think the main things to take away here are that you have to be extremely careful about when you place your debuffs, because certain things might force him into the wrong rotation at the wrong time, which can either reset his health because he's going to heal himself, or could set him up to flip debuffs into buffs and kill your team ahead of when you might expect it. And of course, the main things you want to bring to the fight are some sort of reviving healing, because you're definitely going to lose some champions unless they're all super tanky, and even then that might not be the most optimal thing. You definitely want some form of heal reduction, and Brimstone is definitely a great way to deal a lot of damage. It is a massive chunk of his health pool when he takes a hit from Brimstone. Let me know in the comment section down below if this guide helped you beat Amius for the first time, or just helped you understand Amius a little bit better, having already beat him for the first time. I know for a lot of people this fight is extremely daunting and it's extremely confusing when you don't quite understand it, but hopefully this video has helped you understand it enough to at least to give it one go and see how far you can get in the fight. And I would definitely recommend starting with him on normal mode, because it is a lot more he's a lot more survivable. This was on hard mode, so it's a little bit more catered to those, of course, in the end game with high awakenings and good gear. So yeah, as always, if you did find this video helpful, then be sure to hit that like button down below. It really does help out the channel. And also feel free to hit the subscribe button down below if and only if you are enjoying the content overall on this channel, for more content just like this one in the future. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.